Something just happened in the Middle East that has left intelligence analysts, military strategists, and world leaders completely speechless. Not because it was violent, not because it was a threat, but because it was the one move nobody, not the Pentagon, not the CIA, not the most sophisticated intelligence networks on the planet, saw coming. Saudi Arabia just made a move so calculated, so bold, and so geopolitically significant that it has fundamentally shifted the balance of power in one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. And the United States, for the first time in decades, is sitting in the back seat watching it unfold. To understand why this is such a massive deal, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually means to the world. This is not just a body of water. This is the jugular vein of the global economy. It is a narrow strip of ocean, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, sitting between the coast of Oman and the southern tip of Iran. Every single day, roughly 20 to 21 million barrels of oil pass through this strait. That number represents approximately 20% of the world's total oil consumption. 20%. Gone in an instant if the strait is ever closed. Every time there is a crisis in this region, every time Iran rattles its sabers, every time a tanker gets attacked or a drone flies too close, the entire global economy holds its breath. Oil prices spike, stock markets tremble, world leaders make frantic phone calls. Because whoever controls the Strait of Hormuz holds extraordinary leverage over the entire planet. For decades, the United States has been the self-appointed guardian of this waterway. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, has maintained a permanent, powerful presence in the Persian Gulf, specifically to keep this strait open. America has spent hundreds of billions of dollars, deployed thousands of sailors, and stationed some of its most advanced warships in this region to ensure the free flow of oil. Washington operated under one assumption, that America would always be the dominant force here, and that any major geopolitical shift in the Gulf would happen through American leadership, American diplomacy, or American military muscle. That assumption just shattered. Because Saudi Arabia did not wait for America. Saudi Arabia did not ask for permission. Saudi Arabia did not even send a warning. It went ahead and executed one of the most sophisticated, multi-layered geopolitical strategies the Middle East has seen in generations. And the result is something that will reshape the entire architecture of Gulf security, global energy markets, and the balance of power between the world's superpowers for decades to come. So what exactly did Saudi Arabia do? How did Riyadh manage to outmaneuver Washington in its own backyard? And why is this move sending shockwaves not just through the Middle East, but through Beijing, Moscow, Brussels, and every major capital on Earth? Buckle up. Because this story is far more complex, far more dramatic, and far more consequential than anything you have heard in the mainstream news. Let us go back to where this all really started. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States has been one of the most important, most transactional, and most complicated partnerships in modern history. It was built on a simple foundation. Saudi Arabia provides oil, America provides security. That deal was forged in the desert between President Franklin D. Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz ibn Saud in 1945 aboard the USS Quincy on the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt. It held for decades. America protected Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia kept oil flowing. The Strait of Hormuz stayed open. The world kept turning. But cracks began forming in that relationship years ago. The U.S. shale revolution changed everything. When America began producing its own oil at record levels through hydraulic fracturing, it no longer needed Saudi oil the way it once did. Suddenly, the core of that 1945 agreement started to erode. Saudi Arabia noticed. And Saudi Arabia began looking for new partners, new relationships, and a new role on the world stage, one that was not defined solely by its relationship with Washington. Then came Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known around the world as MBS. Love him or hate him, this man is one of the most strategic political minds operating on the planet right now. He is not content with Saudi Arabia being an oil kingdom. He has a vision, Vision 2030, which is about transforming Saudi Arabia into a global economic, cultural, and geopolitical powerhouse. Under MBS, Saudi Arabia has made bold moves that shocked the world. It launched a war in Yemen. It blockaded Qatar. It executed a stunning social liberalization campaign internally while simultaneously consolidating political power in ways that made Western democracies deeply uncomfortable. And through it all, MBS kept sending a very clear message to Washington. Saudi Arabia will act in its own interests, with or without American approval. The clearest signal of that independence came in 2022 when OPEC+, the oil-producing alliance led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, decided to cut oil production despite intense American pressure to increase supply. President Biden flew to Saudi Arabia personally, fist-bumped MBS, and essentially begged for more oil to bring down American gas prices ahead of the midterm elections. Saudi Arabia said, no. That moment was a turning point. It told the world that the old equation had changed. Saudi Arabia was no longer simply America's loyal oil supplier. It was an independent strategic actor with its own agenda. Now fast forward to the present. The situation around the Strait of Hormuz has been escalating for years. Iran has repeatedly threatened to close the strait in response to Western sanctions and military pressure. The Houthi rebel movement in Yemen, which is backed by Iran, has been launching attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, creating massive disruptions to global trade. Insurance costs for ships in the region have skyrocketed. Major shipping companies have rerouted their vessels thousands of miles around the Cape of Good Hope, just to avoid the danger zone. The economic cost of this instability has been staggering. Billions of dollars in additional shipping costs, delays in global supply chains, and constant upward pressure on energy prices. The United States responded the way it always has, with military force. Washington launched Operation Prosperity Guardian, a multinational naval coalition designed to protect shipping in the Red Sea. American warships fired missiles. American fighter jets struck Houthi targets in Yemen. Billions of dollars of American military hardware was deployed to the region. And the result? The Houthis kept launching missiles. Ships kept getting hit. The threat did not go away. If anything, it intensified. America's military-first approach was not solving the problem. It was managing it at enormous cost, without resolution. And that is exactly the moment Saudi Arabia chose to strike. Not with missiles, but with diplomacy so shrewd, so unexpected, and so perfectly timed that it changed the entire equation in one move. Here is what happened. Saudi Arabia, working through back channels that had been carefully built over years, reached a comprehensive agreement with multiple key players in the Strait of Hormuz crisis simultaneously. This was not a single deal. This was a layered, interlocking set of agreements that addressed the military, economic, and political dimensions of the crisis all at once. The Saudis did not just negotiate with one party. They negotiated with everyone. And they did it quietly, without American coordination, and without American knowledge of the full scope of what was being assembled. The first layer of this strategy was the continuation and deepening of the Saudi-Iran Normalization Agreement that was first brokered by China in March 2023. That agreement was itself a shock to Washington. The idea that Beijing had managed to broker peace between two of the Middle East's most bitter rivals was already a massive geopolitical embarrassment for American diplomacy. But what the world did not fully appreciate at the time was that this agreement was not just the endpoint. It was the beginning of something much larger. Saudi Arabia used the relative calm created by that initial normalization to build a more substantive framework with Tehran. The two countries began discussing not just the resumption of diplomatic ties, but concrete security cooperation around the Persian Gulf. Saudi and Iranian officials held meetings that were kept far from the spotlight. The discussions covered everything from maritime boundaries to the behavior of Iranian-backed militia groups that had been threatening Gulf shipping. Riyadh made clear to Tehran that it was willing to offer significant economic incentives: access to Saudi investment in Iranian infrastructure, potential inclusion of Iran in regional economic frameworks, and a reduction of Saudi support for international pressure campaigns against Tehran, in exchange for Iran's a genuine commitment to keeping the Strait of Hormuz open and restraining its proxies. This was an extraordinary offer, and Tehran, exhausted by years of crippling sanctions and desperate for economic relief that the Americans were never going to provide, was genuinely receptive. The Iranians understood that Saudi Arabia was offering them something America never could: economic normalization without the preconditions Washington always attached. The Saudis were not demanding that Iran dismantle its nuclear program before talks could begin. They were not insisting Iran withdraw from Syria or abandon its regional militias as a precondition. They were engaging Iran as a regional power with legitimate interests and building a framework that acknowledged those interests while drawing clear red lines around behaviors, specifically maritime aggression, that threatened Gulf stability. The second layer of Saudi Arabia's strategy involved the Houthis directly. This is the part that truly stunned American intelligence analysts when details began to emerge. Saudi Arabia had been engaged in its own brutal and costly war in Yemen since 2015. The Houthi conflict had become a massive drain on Saudi resources, a humanitarian catastrophe that generated global criticism of Riyadh, and a strategic failure that had strengthened rather than weakened Iranian influence in Yemen. MBS knew the Yemen war was a trap, and he began looking for a way out that would not look like surrender. The Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping actually gave Saudi Arabia an unexpected opportunity. While Washington was focused on military responses, shooting down Houthi drones and missiles, Riyadh was engaging in quiet negotiation with Houthi leadership through Omani intermediaries. Oman has long played the role of quiet mediator in Gulf conflicts, maintaining relationships with all parties precisely because it refuses to be drawn into factional conflicts. The Saudis leveraged Oman's mediation channels to reach an understanding with the Houthis that had several key components. First, Saudi Arabia agreed to significantly reduce its aerial bombardment campaign in Yemen and to provide humanitarian relief funding for Yemeni civilians, a move that cost Riyadh relatively little but generated enormous goodwill with Houthi leadership. Second, Saudi Arabia communicated through back channels that it was working to secure Iran's restraint of Houthi activities and asked the Houthis to demonstrate reciprocal restraint on Saudi-flagged vessels and vessels carrying Saudi-related cargo. Third, and this is the piece that has not been widely reported, Saudi Arabia offered significant reconstruction funding for Yemen tied to a genuine ceasefire framework. The Houthis, who control most of northern Yemen's population centers and are themselves exhausted after years of devastating war, were far more receptive to this economic carrot than American analysts expected. The result was not a perfect peace. The Houthis did not immediately stop all attacks, but there was a measurable and documented reduction in the frequency and severity of Houthi attacks on vessels with Saudi connections. More importantly, a framework was created for ongoing dialogue that gave all parties, including Iran, a stake in maintaining relative stability in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf corridors. The third layer of Saudi Arabia's strategy is perhaps the most significant in long-term geopolitical terms, and it is the one that has most directly unsettled Washington. Saudi Arabia made a series of strategic investments and agreements with China and India, the world's two largest importers of Gulf oil, that effectively created a new economic security architecture around the Strait of Hormuz that operates independently of American military guarantees. Here is why this matters so much. The traditional logic of American military presence in the Gulf has been that it protects the free flow of oil to the global economy, including to countries like China and India. America was essentially providing free security for everyone, including its geopolitical rivals. China got the benefit of a secure oil supply route protected by the U.S. Navy, without paying a cent for that protection, while simultaneously challenging American power in every other domain. That was always a deeply unstable arrangement. Saudi Arabia recognized this and moved to build a new architecture. Riyadh deepened its economic partnership with Beijing through the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, but crucially, it did so in a way that gave China a direct economic stake in Gulf stability. Chinese state companies are now invested in Saudi petrochemical infrastructure. China is financing Saudi smart city projects, including NEOM. The futuristic megacity MBS is building in the northwest of the kingdom. Saudi Arabia and China have discussed, and in some categories begun implementing, oil transactions denominated in Chinese yuan rather than exclusively in US dollars. Every one of these economic linkages gives China a concrete material reason to want the Strait of Hormuz to remain open and stable. China is no longer just a free rider on American security guarantees. It is now an economic stakeholder in Gulf stability, and Saudi Arabia made sure Beijing understood exactly what that meant. With India, the relationship is different but equally strategic. India, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has been pursuing a foreign policy of strategic autonomy, maintaining relationships with the United States, Russia, China, and the Gulf states simultaneously, refusing to be locked into any single alliance bloc. Saudi Arabia has cultivated this relationship brilliantly. Indian companies have been given significant investment opportunities in Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 projects. The two countries have deepened energy agreements, and crucially, India has been brought into security dialogues about Gulf stability that previously only involved Arab states and Western powers. New Delhi is now a stakeholder in Hormuz security in a way it never was before. What Saudi Arabia has effectively done is build a coalition of economic self-interest around the Strait of Hormuz that includes China, India, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, and even, through the Iran normalization, Tehran itself. Every major player with a stake in that waterway now has a direct economic and diplomatic relationship with Riyadh, and every one of those relationships includes an implicit understanding that the stability of the strait is in everyone's interest. This is not the American model of security, where one dominant military power guarantees order through force. This is a multipolar security architecture held together by overlapping economic interests and diplomatic relationships. And here is what makes this so astonishing. It actually works. Not perfectly, not without friction. But the overall trajectory of security in the Persian Gulf has shifted. Iran has not made any serious move to close the Strait of Hormuz. Houthi attacks, while not eliminated, have become more targeted and less indiscriminate than they were at their peak. Commercial shipping has begun to cautiously return to some of the routes that were previously avoided. The diplomatic channels that Saudi Arabia built are functioning, and the United States, which spent enormous treasure on military responses that produced no lasting stability, is watching a different approach, one it did not design and cannot control, produce results. None of this means the problem is solved. The Middle East does not work that way. Iran's nuclear program is still advancing. The Houthis are still armed and dangerous. The underlying sectarian and geopolitical tensions that have defined this region for centuries did not disappear. But Saudi Arabia's move has fundamentally changed the dynamics. It has given all parties an off-ramp. It has created economic incentives for stability that pure military deterrence could never generate. And it has established Saudi Arabia, not the United States, as the central node of Gulf diplomatic architecture. The implications for American power are profound and uncomfortable. Washington has spent the better part of 8 decades positioning itself as the indispensable power in the Gulf. The security arrangements it built, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, the bases in Qatar and the UAE, the military partnerships with every Gulf state, were all premised on the idea that America was the ultimate guarantor of regional stability. Saudi Arabia's move does not eliminate American military power from the equation, but it does something arguably more significant. It makes that military power less relevant to the actual political outcomes in the region. Think about what has happened. The United States spent years trying to contain Iran through sanctions and military pressure. Saudi Arabia achieved in 2 years of diplomacy what American pressure could not achieve in 2 decades: a genuine reduction in Iranian willingness to destabilize the Gulf. The United States spent years trying to end the Yemen conflict through limited military action and UN-sponsored peace talks that went nowhere. Saudi Arabia found a path to de-escalation by combining economic incentives with back-channel diplomacy that bypassed the bureaucratic UN process entirely. The United States tried to build a maritime security coalition to protect Red Sea shipping. Saudi Arabia built a political coalition that addressed the root causes of the threat rather than just its symptoms. This shift reflects something deeper than just Saudi tactical cleverness. It reflects a structural change in how global power works in the 21st century. American hard power, aircraft carriers, fighter jets, missile defense systems, is still formidable. Nobody doubts that. But hard power alone cannot solve the complex, entangled problems of a region defined by ancient sectarian conflicts, competing national ambitions, economic desperation, and proxy warfare. The tools that actually matter in this environment are economic leverage, diplomatic relationships, and the ability to credibly offer all parties something they need. Saudi Arabia has all 3 of those tools in abundance, and it has learned, under MBS, how to use them with a sophistication that previous Saudi leadership never demonstrated. There's also something happening here with the petrodollar that deserves careful attention. For decades, one of the pillars of American global financial power has been the fact that oil is priced and traded in US dollars. This arrangement, the petrodollar system, means that every country in the world that wants to buy oil must first acquire US dollars, which creates a massive permanent global demand for the American currency that underpins American financial dominance. Saudi Arabia's decision to begin exploring yuan-denominated oil transactions with China is a direct challenge to this system. It is not yet large enough in scale to threaten the petrodollar system today, but it is a crack in the foundation. And the broader Saudi strategy of building economic relationships with China and India that operate outside the dollar-centric framework of American financial power is creating an alternative infrastructure for global energy commerce that did not exist a decade ago. Washington is essentially offering Riyadh the most explicit security commitment it has ever offered a non-NATO ally, in the hope that this will be enough to keep Saudi Arabia firmly in the American camp. But MBS is in no rush to sign that agreement. He understands that the longer he waits, the more leverage he accumulates. Every month that Saudi Arabia demonstrates it can manage Gulf security independently is another month that reduces American leverage over Riyadh's choices. The global energy market dimensions of all this are equally staggering. And we are living through an energy transition, a period when the world is slowly but genuinely moving toward renewable energy sources and away from fossil fuels. Saudi Arabia knows this. Vision 2030 is, at its core, a recognition that oil will not be the foundation of Saudi wealth forever, and an attempt to build a diversified economy before that transition eliminates the kingdom's primary source of power. But in the meantime, during this transition period, which will likely last decades, control over the Strait of Hormuz and the broader flow of Gulf energy remains enormously consequential. By stabilizing the strait through diplomacy, rather than depending on American military power, Saudi Arabia has secured its own energy export infrastructure, in a way that also gives it enormous leverage over the global energy transition itself. Countries that are racing to build renewable energy capacity still need Gulf oil during the transition period. If Saudi Arabia controls the diplomatic architecture around the strait, it controls, to a significant degree, the pace and terms of the global energy transition. That is a form of power that extends far beyond the Middle East. There is one more dimension to this story that most Western media coverage has completely missed, and it involves the internal Saudi political dynamics that made this bold move possible. MBS consolidated power within the Saudi royal family through a controversial process that included the detention of hundreds of princes, businessmen, and officials at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh in 2017 in what was officially described as an anti-corruption campaign but was widely understood as a political purge designed to eliminate rivals and concentrate authority in MBS's hands. Brutal as that process was, it produced a political reality inside Saudi Arabia where there is essentially no effective internal opposition to MBS's strategic vision. Previous Saudi foreign policy was often paralyzed by internal disagreements within the vast royal family, competing factions with competing visions, and a deeply conservative establishment that resisted bold moves. MBS eliminated that friction. For better or worse, Saudi Arabia now has a single unified strategic vision and the political will to execute it. That is what made this multi-pronged Hormuz strategy possible. When we look at the reactions from world capitals, the range of responses tells you everything you need to know about the significance of what just happened. In Beijing, there is barely concealed satisfaction. China's strategic partnership with Saudi Arabia is one of the pillars of its Middle East policy, and the fact that Riyadh has successfully built a security architecture that reduces American dominance in the Gulf, while simultaneously giving China a greater stake in regional stability, is exactly what Beijing has been working toward. Chinese state media has been notably positive in its coverage of Saudi Arabia's diplomatic moves, describing them as evidence of a new multipolar world order taking shape. In Moscow, there is a more complicated reaction. Russia and Saudi Arabia have a working relationship through OPEC+, but they are also competitors for European and Asian energy markets. Russia watches Saudi Arabia's rise as an independent geopolitical actor with a mixture of grudging respect and wariness. A more stable Gulf that allows Saudi oil to flow freely is not necessarily in Russia's interest, since it keeps global oil prices at levels that hurt Russian revenues. But Russia also appreciates that Saudi Arabia's moves weaken American dominance in a region where Moscow has long sought to reestablish its influence. In European capitals, there's alarm mixed with grudging admiration. European countries are deeply dependent on Gulf energy and have been shaken by the energy crisis triggered by the Russia-Ukraine war. The idea that a Saudi-led diplomatic architecture might provide more reliable long-term stability in Gulf energy supply than American military guarantees is genuinely appealing to European policymakers who are tired of energy instability. But Europeans are also deeply uncomfortable with the nature of MBS's government, its human rights record, its treatment of dissidents, its consolidation of authoritarian power. They want the stability benefits of Saudi Arabia's moves without wanting to be seen as endorsing the regime that produced them. And in Washington, there's a complex mixture of frustration, embarrassment, and grudging recognition. American officials are not stupid. They understand what has happened. They understand that Saudi Arabia has successfully executed a geopolitical strategy that achieved real results in an arena where American policy had been struggling. The frustration is not just about being outmaneuvered, it is about the implications for the entire framework of American power in the Middle East that has been the foundation of U.S. foreign policy for generations. If Saudi Arabia can secure the Strait of Hormuz without the American military, what exactly is the argument for maintaining the enormous American military presence in the Gulf? That question is now being asked, loudly and seriously, in Washington policy circles. The deeper lesson of what Saudi Arabia has done is one that applies far beyond the Middle East. It is a lesson about how power actually operates in the modern world. For decades, the dominant paradigm was that military power was the ultimate currency of international relations. Whoever had the strongest military had the most influence. That paradigm is not entirely wrong. Military power still matters enormously. But what Saudi Arabia has demonstrated is that in an interconnected global economy, economic power combined with sophisticated diplomacy can achieve outcomes that military force cannot. Iran did not back down from American military pressure, but Iran responded to Saudi economic incentives. The Houthis did not stop their attacks because of American missiles, but they moderated their behavior in response to Saudi diplomatic engagement combined with economic offers. China did not become a stakeholder in Gulf stability because of American military presence, but it became one because Saudi Arabia gave it economic reasons to care. This is the new geopolitics. It is messier than the old Cold War model. It involves more players, more overlapping interests, more moral ambiguity. Saudi Arabia is not a democracy. It is not a country whose values align with the liberal international order that the United States champions. But it is a country that has demonstrated extraordinary strategic sophistication in navigating the 21st century's complex multipolar reality. And in doing so, it has permanently altered the architecture of power in one of the world's most critical regions. The Strait of Hormuz is still there, its waters still flow, but the political reality around it, who controls it, who guarantees its safety, who has the leverage over its future, has fundamentally changed. America did not see this coming. And now that it has happened, Washington is scrambling to figure out how to respond to a world that no longer fits the assumptions upon which its entire Middle East strategy was built. Saudi Arabia did something huge, something historic, something that the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world failed to anticipate and failed to prevent. And the ripples of that move, through global energy markets, through great power competition, through the slow erosion of American financial dominance, through the emergence of a new multipolar order, are going to be felt for generations. The question now is not what Saudi Arabia did. We know what it did. The question is what comes next. Can America adapt to a Middle East where it is no longer the indispensable power? Can Iran honor the commitments it has made to Riyadh, or will the pressures of its internal politics eventually shatter the fragile normalization? Can the Houthi de-escalation hold as Yemen's underlying humanitarian crisis remains unresolved? Can Saudi Arabia actually deliver on the ambitious economic promises it has made to China, India, and its Arab neighbors? Or will Vision 2030's ambitious targets prove harder to achieve than MBS has promised? These are the questions that will define the next decade in the Middle East. They are questions without simple answers. But one thing is certain. They are being asked in a world that Saudi Arabia just irrevocably changed. A world where the rules of Gulf security, energy geopolitics, and great power competition have been rewritten by a kingdom that the world underestimated for far too long. The Strait of Hormuz is open, for now. But nothing about who controls its future, who profits from its stability, and who pays the price for any future instability will ever be the same again. Saudi Arabia made sure of that, and the rest of the world, starting with the United States of America, is only just beginning to understand what that means.